Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Je vais commencer tranquillement pour vous dire un bienvenue à cet événement tellement attendu. So, hello everyone. I'm just going to gently begin our activity today while people are filing into the room. It's kind of nice. It's like if we were all together in physical space, people would be coming through the doorway and trying to find a seat that they like with a nice view, etc. So my name is Nick Luca. I'm the interim director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel today, which has been organized and prompted by the excellent work of our professor in practice, our McConnell Foundation professor in practice, Anna Brandusescu. I'm only going to very briefly say hello, and je vais aussi mentionner que l'événement aura lieu en anglais et en français, mais plutôt en anglais pour le panel. Cependant, vous pourrez poser des questions dans le chat en français et à l'oral si vous voulez. Mais aussi pour dire bienvenue au nom du CIRM, le Centre de recherche interdisciplinaire en études montréalaises, et aussi de faire une reconnaissance territoriale, de reconnaître le fait que McGill est sur les territoires traditionnels de Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Et on est très heureux d'accueillir tout le monde sur ce lieu de rencontre. So a short territorial acknowledgement, just to say that McGill University, to acknowledge, is on land that has been historically and traditionally the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and we are thankful to be coming together in this place that has long served as a place of gathering and sharing of knowledge. Very much the theme and focus of our activity today. So it is my very great pleasure to turn the podium over to our moderator, Bianca, Wylie, who is public technology advocate and the co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. Please, thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Nick. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Couple things to say before we get going. I think the first one is that we're in a pandemic. This is a really difficult time. We're all grieving for different reasons at different moments, but we also want to try to move together in thinking about, how we can spend each day in the pursuit of what, I think we have some shared values in our communities that we're going to talk about today, and how to actually do differently each day to get to a different place than we are now. But those are two things at once. So the first one is, it's a tough time. We want to be kind to each other, have a constructive discussion, but be aware that it is a hard time. And secondly, my role today is to keep us on track and on time, for sure, but also to be what a colleague of mine, Nicole Sworn, used to call ruthlessly constructive. And so I want to be interrogating us at every moment as to not do what another great colleague of mine has called admiring the problem. So we are going to talk a bit about an issue today, but we're really going to try to come together in conversation about the what do we do about it part. So that's going to be what I'm really focused on in my role and keeping us on time and on track. So to that end, I'm going to hand it over to Anna to provide some context for this discussion that really looks at the subject of artificial intelligence in Canada, issues of power, issues of public power, issues of private power, issues of finance, issues of accountability, issues of justice, issues of racism, issues of white supremacy. There is no shortage of things contained in the presentation that Anna is going to share. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Anna. It's going to take about 15 minutes to step through that, and then we're going to have a conversation. So once Anna is finished, I'll introduce the panelists, but that's the lay of the land. And we are going to stick on time, really, because we want to protect the time at the end for a conversation. So please, as you're thinking, jot down questions, jot down notes, provocations, whatever, but also in kindness and in a way to be constructive together, and also knowing we're all having a bit of a hard time. So let's be honest about that. So Anna, I would like to hand it over to you to share your presentation, and I will keep time and I'll give you a little warning at about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Okay, you can see it? It's all good? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you all in the pandemic and everything. This project started right before the pandemic, but it kind of kicked off during it. And in some ways, it kept me sane, but also didn't. So anyway, I've been looking forward to this event for months. So I'm just going to get started with giving you an overview of this research and also the report that you can dig through later if you haven't already. So a little bit about me. I spent a lot of time at the intersection of government and civil society, but not government and industry. So this project was really try to get to know how industry interacts and engages with government primarily and the public secondarily. A little bit about this research. It was first a massive team effort. It's truly like thank you to the Korean team for making it all happen. There's been so many iterations and so many pieces and components to it. I really appreciate all the support around it. Also to the moderator and panelists, you've played such an important role. So thank you also for being such a big part of the project. So a little bit about the methodology now. It was a massive analysis of public documents and data sets, and also qualitative research, which included 53 interviews with Canada-based experts, government officials, industry researchers and analysts, legal practitioners, nonprofit practitioners, human rights advocates, and academics working in or adjacent to the AI landscape. So this project really came together to examine AI policy and government funding in Canada and to bring awareness to government funding data sets, especially open government ones. So how do we engage with those? How does the public engage with the researchers, journalists, policy makers abroad to actually use this data that's being published by our government? And it's really to publish research that other people can use and build on. So this is really a very foundational piece that a lot of different sectors and domain experts can really use to build on. So please, I really encourage you to look at all the open data sets around it and everything I kind of put together so you can pull something and analyze it, bring in recommendations, look to the future and make it more about hope rather than, as Bianca put it, admiring the problem. So given that, the long-term goal of this is to really find collective ways to question, change, and improve policy and regulation for AI technologies in Canada, but also beyond. So why AI funding? Well, it's really about revealing how the government is building the innovation economy, who invests in the most, who do governments invest in the least, and also to address part of AI governments that is overlooked. We really look at the technical aspects of AI, the harms and the good things, but we don't really address and talk about money that much. And I mean, I'm really in a unique space that I'm really grateful for, where I can talk about this stuff independently and openly, and I'm funded by somebody who allows me to do that. A lot of people in this space cannot talk about this. So I just want to make that clear about why this conversation is important. It's always problematic when you can't question power to change it. And so let's talk about money today. So at least public money. The private money is a whole other thing that also needs to be discussed, but maybe I'll leave that note for you to think about in the discussion. So this is also about bringing understanding to government around funding of AI technologies and how they don't just potentially cause risks, they actually have caused harm and exacerbating structural bias. And this is across race, gender, class, and much more. But this is, back to the status quo and the geopolitics of this stuff, right? So who funds leads? And we see this global AI race that's supporting the tech innovation economy. We see it with tech empires like China and the US. We see it with Singapore, UK, and France, and the EU in general. And we also can look at funding as power and control, as well as opacity. And it's the opacity in the AI technologies that transfers into their funding networks as well. So there's increasing concerns over how AI is governed in the way that it is funded, and an AI industry that is being built without taking into account human rights and collective rights. So what do we have? Well, we have billions of dollars that have been committed, $1 billion from federal government contributions that have been awarded across Canada, and $1.2 billion of planned government investments that have been publicly announced for the province of Quebec and Montreal. So this is as of August 2020, these numbers. And of course, then there's the more massive number in private investments for just one city alone, $2 billion for Montreal. So quickly, I'm just going to take you through the AI ecosystem. There are many ecosystems maps out there on the AI landscape, but all of them are PDFs and all of them are mostly just logos put together. But what I really wanted to have is an open data set, just a tabular list of these entities, their headquarters, where they're located, where they operate, where they're incorporated, whether they're a public or private entity. So Elisa Kyle and myself put together this data set and that we published in July of 2020 to make it open for everyone to contribute. So that's the link. This is also a little shout out to please contribute if you want. It's open for feedback and ideas. It includes, everything between venture capital funds, angel investors, startups, big tech companies, but also big consulting and audit firms who are, a lot of the times don't make these AI lists, but they play a super important key role in this, as you'll see later. It also includes academic labs and initiatives, nonprofits, and of course, government institutions. So it's very basic, as in a lot more work can be done. We can add more columns to include subtypes and specific sectors that these companies operate in. So I invite you to give feedback and collaborative work on building this public data set together. So now I'm going to try to make this fun. AI policy for some people is super fun, but for the majority, maybe not so much. But it's still important to talk about a little bit around who is involved, right? So who decides on making this, who made the AI policy, who's making the AI policy in Canada? Well, first we have a few major departments and agencies involved. So these are the ones that are the most involved. The Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat creates and leads on AI policy in the federal government. They also provide leadership on digital government and open government. So they're TBS in short. Then we have ISED, which is the Innovation, Science and Development Canada, which coordinates the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, the AI Supercluster Initiative, and international partnerships. Then we have CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which leads the Pan-Canadian AI research strategy, and they are directly connected to ISED in that coordination. Fourth, we have the Public Services and Procurement Canada that leads procurement across the government, including procurement of AI, which is super important. Justice Canada reviews and provides legal opinions on law and AI, and Global Affairs Canada sets international AI policy agenda. We also have these other lists of departments and agencies that are involved and also play an important role. But I'm just going to highlight the National Defense and National Research Council because they award the most contracts. So within policy, we also have the important roles of these three AI research institutes, MILA, Vector Institute, and AMI. So there is a concentration of research and activity via these three major AI research institutes that are all directly connected to CIFAR. So we have Joshua Bengio, Jeffrey Hinton, and Richard Sutton that were selected very quickly to become the scientific directors of the institutes. And CIFAR's public-private funding mechanism is used to connect researchers and people. And why CIFAR is such an important player is because they endorse public, private, and academic partnerships. So on to global AI policy, which is super important to think about the geopolitics of Canada's role in the AI scene and in its investments towards AI technologies. So I'm just going to lead you through just very quickly a couple of key dates.
Yeah, and Anna, you just had about 5 minutes just for
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll just let you quickly skim through this. The important part about this is that ISET is leading these international convenings to create global AI policy that influenced national level work. And this stuff rolled out very quickly. As you can see, from June 2018 to May 2019, over a year, many important decisions have been made. So when they brought this over to the national scene, there has been this sort of movement within the Canadian government on responsible use of AI in government. There are two components to this. And this is all a part of actually the digital government strategy, which is important to note because there is no specific AI strategy for government. So there are two policies, and one of them is this directive on automated decision-making, which comes under the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. So within this, we see that there's deployment of ADM systems, automated decision-making systems, to reduce risks to Canadians and federal institutions and lead to more efficient, accurate, consistent, and interpretable decisions made pursuant to Canadian law. So the important thing to note there is that there is no mention of accountability or harm in this language to describe the directive. So the availability of data and information on ADM systems in federal institutions is used where appropriate. So again, leaving a lot of room for interpretation. It's good to know that since April of last year, there has been mandatory compliance with the directive. The second piece of major policy for responsible AI in government in Canada is the algorithmic impact assessment. So the AIA is used to determine how acceptable an AI solution is with this ethical perspective to it. It's a tool that's basically 60 questions on business process, system design, and data that's made for designers and builders of AI systems. And one of its goals is to create a public-facing data set of what is automated and why, and to shine a light on ADM systems being used in government and by government. So now to AI funding. I'm just going to walk you through quickly to the two funding streams for AI that I've looked at it in my research. One is grants and contributions, and the other is contracts. So it's important to just kind of define what this means. So grants are unconditional awards based on funding criteria. There are very little grants here, which makes sense because so much of this is like industry driven and for-profit driven. Contributions, on the other hand, are conditional awards based on performance. So again, back to the for-profit sector that usually gets contributions. The second stream is contract. So these are awarded to entities that will deliver a good or a service specifically. So first up, we have AI grants and contributions by stakeholder group. As you can see, the majority goes to for-profit organizations, 795 million, so many millions. And not-for-profit organizations and charities together get 174 million, and academia gets the least with 139 million. So there's a total of 1,307 awards from September 2007 to June 2020, totaling $1.1 billion. To get this data, I use specific keywords: artificial intelligence, AI, ADM, machine learning, and deep learning. However, there are certain limitations in the way that the database collects specific sections of a grant. So for example, there have been grants that have been awarded that work primarily on AI research, such as the Feminist and Accessible Publishing Communications and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series, led by Alexandra Ketchum, so which is a SSHRC-funded project, but because the project itself, which is a connection grant, doesn't mention AI specifically, it doesn't make it on this list. So just making a note that there could be a lot of research done around what gets, when you type in something, what your search query gives you and the limitations of that.
Okay, and Anna, just getting to wrap it up time here.
Yeah,
we're at time.
So the Canada AI grants and contributions by province and territories show again that the majority of the money goes to Quebec, British Columbia, and Ontario, and there's no money that goes to the territories. So the top funded entities around AI grants and contributions, we could see the top 4 are the superclusters and other startups and a few major universities that get this funding. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but again, this is all open data and open data sets that you can look at later, available online. So the most important part of this is that who awards the most AI grants and contributions? Well, it's the National Research Council of Canada. However, who awards the highest amount of AI contributions is ISED. So with Government of Canada AI contracts, which again, I said are different from grants and contributions, there are actually a lot fewer contracts than contributions. So 93 in total with only 95 million. But these are specific AI contracts. And so then I took a step back and thought, well, AI kind of permeates across IT and tech procurement in general. Let's look at tech procurement. And I'm going to skip this one for now, but it's an important slide. So tech procurement is important because it does AI. It's not specifically AI, but again, we see how invested government is in maintaining these relationships and sustaining these relationships with these major companies, and not all, but some are big tech as well. So these are the numbers for that. There's an entire contracts of vendors data set that looks at specifically the pre-qualified AI suppliers, but there is also a data set, an annex that looks at this specific entire list of vendors and how much they've been awarded. So within AI in Montreal and Quebec, we see sort of the funding flows and investments, and there's also an interactive map available for this. There's the governmental and geopolitical influence is ever present in the need to position Montreal and Quebec in the global information economy. To this extent, AI has become a key facet of Quebec's economic strategy and has invested heavily in it. And one piece of policy that supports this is the Montreal Declaration for the Development of Responsible AI that is led by Université de Montréal to champion AI ethics. So this was done in 2017, and it was done by a niche group that's represented by public-facing figures on the city's AI scene, and its principles leave much room for interpretation with no legal enforcement, leaving accountability of AI technologies and its actors unknown. And I really recommend this great presentation by our panelists and legal researchers, Yuan Stevens, that presented critical research on the Montreal AI scene and influence on the global AI industry. So Quebec's AI strategy basically is like any other government strategy when it comes to tech innovation, but specifically this is important to note that there's this support for IVADO and for Scale AI, which is a supercluster that is the highest awarded AI contribution by the federal government. And we're in COVID times, and what was also interesting about AI is that the government prioritized AI skills even during the pandemic at the same level as orderlies and workers in food processing, for example. So quickly over the main findings. One, public investments in AI technologies primarily benefit the private sector. So what we see is government funding for AI goes mainly to industry academia and the academia adjacent to that industry. The focus for academia and AI is on capacity building for the private sector to do research in AI and train students to develop AI skills required by the workforce to support the economy. So the close dynamic between government and industry provides insight into the funding and investment processes behind AI. The sociologist Ruha Benjamin aptly writes that we should consider how private industry choices are in fact public policy decisions. This issue is amplified in that so much of AI resides in the private realm. So it is worth questioning then how the innovation economy is influenced by private interests and private power, and by extension, how AI publicly policy gets written. So I'm going to do a quick shout out to what interviewees have said across the board, which is that organizations and groups need greater role in decision making. Organizations that work on digital inclusion, such as AI Impact Alliance, and we're grateful to have with us today Valentine Goddard as panelists, Digital Justice Lab, Citizen Lab, and Montreal AI Ethics Institute, initiatives like the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence Working Group, Indigenous AI, public interest advocacy organization, Open Media, and civic tech nonprofits, Open North, which we're also grateful that Nabeel Ahmed has joined us as a panelist here as well. So second, we have no national government AI strategy. So even though we have this pan-Canadian AI strategy is really about research, the government's AI policies found under the Government of Canada's Strategic Plan for Information Management and Information Technology 2017 to 2021. I wish I can find an acronym for that, but that's where it sits currently. So we have this directive on ADM, which is only legally binding for federal government departments and agencies, but not for anything that's outsourced to and the AI products created in-house or outsourced to private suppliers. But it doesn't go and extend to subnational governments or to industry. There are also many issues with ADM systems, and I'll just cover the one in Quebec. So in Quebec, the Ministry of Health and Social Services made it mandatory for youth protection services to use an AI software that sometimes generates reports contradicting the clinical judgment of the worker, who often spends 15 hours meeting the child, parents, and professionals. And in this case, because the ADM wrongfully predicted the urgency of care with no further human intervention, it resulted in the death of an infant. That case is still ongoing. That ADM is still being used. Third, companies linked to human rights abuses can pre-qualify as government AI suppliers. Not so fast. So companies specifically, here we're looking at the Government of Canada's pre-qualified AI supplier list, which includes at least one company with a known track record of causing or contributing to human rights abuses, and that is Palantir Technologies, Inc. So Palantir in the past and present provides software programs created for the US Department of Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, ICM, and Falcom, which is a software that enabled the government to identify, share information about, investigate, and track migrants and asylum seekers to effect arrests and workplace raids. So this is all in Amnesty's USA's report from the last fall, and I encourage you to read it. Palantir has also committed to our AIA just fine. And this is important to know about, because this stuff isn't just happening in Canada. It doesn't mean that it's not happening elsewhere. So if Palantir decides to not commit human rights abuses in Canada, doesn't mean they do it elsewhere. And it leads us to question if internal ethics frameworks are really enough. So in this way, corporations find maximizing profits for their shareholders is nothing new. However, government partnering with a company linked to human rights abuses should cause concern. And four, concentrations of power provide advantages to a handful of entities. So we've seen that throughout in terms of the provinces, in terms of the few universities and research nonprofits, startups, and international big tech companies. So the majority of federal government AI grants and contributions are funded by research institutions. And then there's also this, made in Canada appeal, but we really see a lot of foreign actors, especially investors that are involved in the AI ecosystem. And this leads to the acquisition. So that we had two major acquisitions happening in the AI space. One was North Inc. to Google, and the other is Element AI that just happened recently to ServiceNow. So these acquisitions reflect ongoing patterns of creating business models that appeal to large tech companies. As we see, like one major contribution that was given by ISET to Element AI, the 20 million that made the top 10 entities list earlier, has actually been given back. Still, there's still a question around the way that governments and corporations invest heavily in AI and R&D, but there is no formal reporting of such data for the development of AI metrics and also impact. So in the end, what we see is that Canada is marketing itself as an innovator and leader on the global stage by using AI as the new driver to support the innovation economy. But in many ways, the governments are funding a big unknown. So in this, leaving it on a more optimistic note, we need governments to keep companies accountable, to be accountable to the public, and then also to have access public scrutiny and independent oversight of the way this stuff is built, but also of the institutions that are managing and putting all of this together. And lastly, to remember, this is a global responsibility. Yes, there are jurisdictions, but all of this still goes across borders as well. So that's really important to know when building, procuring, and using AI. And I'm just going to show you these quickly to show how many people have been involved in this project. Thank you so much. And there's more details here at the full report.
Okay, so thank you, Anna. Doing some clapping, Yuan, I like it. Doing some clapping here, fantastic. There's tons of questions coming in, and so please keep them coming. We have protected a good chunk of time to have an open discussion. Before we get to that, we've got 4 panelists here, Valentine, Nabeel, Yuan, and Jess. And so we're gonna start with Valentine, and each of our panelists will introduce themselves and then sort of take this setting that Anna's done and take one issue or one thread and give us a bit more detail, and then we'll all come together and have a conversation. So Valentine, if you would like to go first, that would be super. And I'll give you a warning at 4 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Anna, for your incredible groundwork, and thank you for taking the courageous position of putting numbers out there. AI Impact Alliance is a nonprofit organization that I founded in the fall of 2017 in the face of an obvious misallocation of funds that I felt would have a huge impact on how AI would influence our lives. The idea was to increase the voice of civil society organizations in the development and governance of AI. It is indeed not always an easy position to take to talk about money in AI. I was literally told at the beginning not to do so. I was aggressively warned not to do so. So thank you, Anna, for your courageous work, and thank you for the organizations that founded this, this research and this publication. I hope it continues to grow from here. And to introduce myself a little bit, I'm a lawyer, I'm a mediator, I'm an artist, I'm the founder of AI Impact Alliance. I've, since those past 4 years, become an expert at the United Nations, part of expert groups on the role of public institutions in the development of AI, in the digital governance groups. So that's the kind of work that I've been doing. And I forgot to start my timer, so I'm going to start it now. And my facial recognition is not working because I'm not really looking at it. Okay, start. I have 4 minutes and 30 seconds starting now. So I don't want to go too much about the work that I've been doing. Just please have a look at my website, valentinegoddard.com. You'll find lots of information about various publications. Our YouTube channel has various videos talking about the social impact of AI and the type of work that we're doing, and the role of civil society organizations in the future of AI. So I wanted to share my screen very quickly to dive in a little bit into the work that Anna presented earlier. So the core idea is that AI funding policies will determine the scope of advantage AI can bring in society. So I've taken and rounded up the numbers that Anna presented. We have for-profits here, receiving overall a major chunk. And this is not like an exact representation, but an attempt to showcase the disproportionate allocation of funds in some type of organizations. As a lawyer, of course, I think it's obvious to just remind everyone that as a company, there's only two things you can do when you start a business. You can incorporate for-profit or as a non-profit. So those are the two legal formats that you can choose. So here we have this form of allocation. This is not for-profit allocation. We had an overall total of 174. Within that, one of those not-for-profits is the digital technology superclusters, which most likely represents for-profit organizations receiving 152 million. Within the not-for-profit organizations, we had a discussion prior to this panel, and I've been having that discussion over the past couple of years as to what exactly within not-for-profit organizations, which ones are actual civil society organization, and what's the difference and what's defining and what's important about involving them and funding and supporting their involvement and capacity to engage in the future of AI. So what are civil society organizations exactly? Civil society is a movement. It's not registered. It cannot receive funding. It can gain momentum. It can influence policy ultimately, but it is not a registered organization that can receive money. Civil society organizations are not-for-profits that are registered organizations. But contrary to a general not-for-profit, which could be a hockey association, which could be the Quebec Bar, Ontario Bar, or it could also be industry representation, such as the digital technology supercluster, which obviously doesn't have the same goals as a civil society organization, such as NGOs, community-based organizations, unions, or independent not-for-profit organizations that strive to achieve sustainable development goals, human rights, social justice goals. I often get asked, well, so what about social entrepreneurs? Are they part of civil society organizations? I would argue that yes, a for-profit social purpose organization with a strong, committed business model to supporting sustainable development goals, fighting for social justice issues, would be part of civil society organizations, but they would fall, like a co-op, for example, would fall into the for-profit model. What about academia? Do we think, and this would be argued, and this is important because I often see consultations saying we are involving civil society. Is academia part of civil society? And should we count them when we try to granulate the analysis of the funding policies in Canada? I would argue that academia is not part of civil society organizations because even though in Canada they do have institutional autonomy, they have varying levels of collaboration with civil society and civil society organizations. Therefore, I don't believe they are CSOs. CSO quick checklist, are they doing outreach, advocacy? Are they providing the much needed political and social balance in democratic systems? Are they nonpartisan? Are they independent? Are they engaging citizen interest and trust? So that's, stop share. So that's just what I wanted to feed our discussion going forward and hear everybody's questions, because if we go back to the first slide that I showed, civil society organizations, according to Anna's analysis right now, are receiving pretty much, I think yesterday I went through the Excel sheet and I found one organization or two. It needs to be better represented. That is important because civil society organizations will bring more information to the general public, will really feed different perspectives and represent various values and perspectives moving forward. So I'm going to end it here, but I look forward to everybody's questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Valentine. And I'm glad for your focus on language, because I think sometimes we, use terms or words and we may think that it means the same thing, but not so much. So we will return to this in conversation for sure. And Nabeel, if you would, over to you.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you again, Anna, for doing this research. I think it's really important. For everyone, my name is Nabeel. I'm a Senior Program Officer at Open North, one of Canada's leading nonprofits that works across multiple sectors to support the responsible and effective use of data technology. And we have a very strong emphasis on transparency, accountability, and inclusion. And I think these are all themes that actually come through in the report. And the main point that I want to make today really is to ask a question about how the outcomes, how the AI investments that we've seen, that Anna has documented, are linked to the needs of Canadians and all those who live in Canada today. In my kind of observation, these links aren't clear. In fact, the findings point to a future where Canadian interests will increasingly be under de facto control of an increasingly smaller group of private actors. And I think that raises some questions about democratic accountability. As Anna said, we need to talk about money and we need to talk about power. And I think the investments that have been made to date reflect existing power structures and have implications for the distribution of future benefits. To riff on a famous line, it's kind of overused now, but I'm going to bring it back. The future is here and it is being distributed unevenly. And I think I just want to name a few things that people who read the report will see as well. Anna says, AI policy is built to support technological innovation that benefits long-term scientific advancements in the economy. If you look at the Pan-Canadian AI strategy that CIFAR leads, as well as the intended outcomes of Scale AI, the technology supercluster, which is the biggest recipient of federal funding, the priorities are fairly similar. Increase productivity in academic research, enhance Canada's profile in AI research and training, collaboration with the private sector, attract outstanding AI talent for universities and industry, and translate, this is the line that I really like, translate AI research discoveries in the private and public sectors, leading to socioeconomic benefits for Canada. None of these are bad. I think these are all valuable, but I think we're far removed from the actual needs of all those who live in Canada today. How do our AI investments address the climate crisis and colonial relations today? How does tech innovation sync up with social innovation? I note the presence of Margie Mendel and Nancy Ningtan, who are leaders in the Canadian social economy landscape. Issues like affordable housing, food security, digital inclusion. And I don't mean to dismiss the reality that many of the investments in AI are actually addressing these. What I'm pointing out is that they're not clearly linked, and I think that's important. The other kind of note that I want to make in my remaining minute is, I think we need to also take a step back and think about why does government think that AI will help us achieve these social benefits? Why are we investing in the use of data and automated decision making? I mean, really, which Canadian said, I want a black box algorithm to define my future? I don't think any Canadian said that. I think they said, let's use data evidence-based decision making, but I think we've seen over and over again in Canada that despite data, despite evidence, decisions are not necessarily taken in those, with evidence in consideration. And sometimes even evidence is hidden. And anyone who's done a Freedom of Information request in Canada will know that it's a nightmare to get information in this country across all levels of government. And really, this notion that we can take the politics out of it is very politically popular, but it's a terrible approach to actually thinking about power, because that's really how power functions, right? It's often in the dark. And I think when we can name it, then we can engage with it. And I think that's why if you look at the grants and contributions of the contracts, we should be able to ask who will own the code, who will be held accountable for any potential harms of the use of AI, such as facial recognition technology. I also want to note, this is something that at Open North we see regularly. A lot of the data that exists out there is flawed or it's biased. And we see that in algorithmic hiring or algorithmic sentencing, which really reproduces just the biases of history. So I think we need to really think about how are the, so Canadians have definitely said, let's use the latest tools to meet our needs. How are we actually doing that? And I think for me, this is a good finding that so many different departments are involved. I would really also question how are they actually able to coordinate across themselves, because there are so many different teams. The current finding, I just have 10 seconds left, so I will wrap up quickly. I'll say that, I mean, the finding that, multiple governments across Canada are putting too many eggs into too few baskets, I think is actually something that's shared in other research. And I want to just cite in policy options, there was a research, there was a paper, an article that Craig Lamb and Daniel Monroe wrote about, Canada risks having, and I'm going to read out loud, Canada intangibles-focused R&D spending is increasingly led by foreign-controlled firms, and Canada risks having large parts of a digital economy, including the talent and data and the intellectual property, working for the benefit of others. So I think this is a broader issue that I think this report has done a great job of highlighting. So thank you for that.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Nabeel. And that making those linkages between how things are used and, in terms of artificial intelligence in pre-existing policy issues, right? Like making that clearer, because I think that's about this, like being constructive, is there is intent to address some of these social issues, but how are those linkages? And to your point about power and intellectual property, I think we should return to for some discussion. So thank you for both those points. Yuan, over to you, please.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Anna, for having me part of this panel. I'm very grateful to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about privacy law in Canada and some of the issues I see. I might spend a little bit of time admiring the problem, which I think is a great phrase. Thank you for that, Bianca. And the reason I will do that intentionally is because there is a problem and there is such a need for more investigation that I want to highlight an area for further research. First of all, I'll also say thank you, Anna, for your research and for just touching on the sort of drop of research that I did that is a part of the overarching research that you've done in terms of mapping this Canadian ecosystem with respect to government funding and private actors, how that's being eroded, and then AI. So I just want to say that your work is very important. So the questions that I'm going to ask today are, when Canada's Constitution was drafted and enacted in 1982, privacy law, was it an issue or not for the people who drafted that? I also want to ask, do we want to live in a society where most of our sensitive information can be used to analyze and control our behavior? In order to meaningfully contribute to the questions and the conversation that I'm raising, I'll need to explain a little bit of how privacy law works in Canada. For those who understand, you'll know what this means. But how privacy law works in Canada is that it's a bit of a mess, to put it concisely, TLDR. Ideally, I'd have some visuals. I would love to create a mind map one day to explain for the average person, but for now, what I'll do is I'll explain it verbally, orally, so you can understand. We have federal privacy law in Canada, and we have provincial privacy law in Canada. Provincial privacy law will typically apply to municipalities and other aspects of the public sector that are governed by the province. This is going to be a bit dry, but I trust you; it's important. Or I can confirm that it's very important. So at the federal level, privacy law is broken up into the public sector and the private sector. The Privacy Act governs all of the federal government, though there are agencies that are exempt from that because they have their own privacy sort of procedures. And there's a public sector privacy act, or sorry, privacy law, that is. You can see how already the terminology is very confusing, even for someone like myself who's an expert on these topics. So why that is important is because I'll raise issues later, but a little sneak peek is that there's this differentiation in Canada's privacy law all around that differentiates between the private and the public sector. But a question I have is, does that make sense to separate these two? I will say as well that some of you may know about the Office for the Privacy Commissioner, which is actually an ombudsman. This entity helps people who have issues with privacy law at the federal level, sometimes the provincial level when they have jurisdiction. And if you have a complaint, you raise your issue first with the OPC, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. However, the OPC can only issue non-binding opinions, essentially. If you really want something enforced, such as the fact that a company called Clearview AI has been scraping your data without your permission, you're going to have to appeal that decision if you are party to that case. You're going to have to appeal it to a court, the federal court, that can actually hear your decision and render a binding decision. At the provincial level, it's also broken up into the private sector and the public sector. However, Alberta, BC, and Quebec have their own laws that apply if information stays within the province. Canada's federal private sector law will apply if data ever crosses borders outside of Canada or within Canada, which you can see was drafted in contemplation of there only ever being paper and not digital data. So I like to raise, and why this relates to artificial intelligence policy in Canada is because we have one of the most important mechanisms for protecting our rights in Canada. And right now, what exists needs to be changed. I'm admiring the problem because I think the problem needs to be further investigated. And what the problem is, right now, our privacy law, yes, if you have an issue, you can make a complaint to the Ombudsman, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, but the government branch that is in charge of making changes to our privacy laws for the private sector is the ministry, I said, the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Industry. And what that means is that right now, if you want changes made to the Privacy Act, the private sector privacy law, you can rely on an entity that is going to favor and has the interest of advancing innovation in Canada. But what I believe is happening is that innovation that needs to happen in privacy law is actually being stifled because of an interest in corporate innovation, which is a bit strange. You might think, why am I talking about innovation in the context of legislation? But I think that innovation is such a buzzword. It's such an important thing for people who have who want change to happen. And I think we need to talk about innovation in the context of legislation and regulation that needs to be advanced as well. Just to break this down a little bit further, Bianca, how much time do I have?
Got about a minute left for your wrap up. This is great. Perfect.
So I will say that if you are really nerdy, you can look up how this works. Right now, the reason why the Minister of, I said, has the mandate of advancing Canada's private sector privacy law is because Section 91, subparagraph 2 of the Constitution Act gives the federal government the power to regulate over trade and commerce. For that reason, this is why the Ministry of Innovation, Science, Economic Development in Canada has the responsibility for advancing our privacy laws. I'll just end with a few last statements as well, is that there's a few problems with Canada's privacy law. We're no longer dealing with just privacy. We're actually dealing with dignity, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and data protection law as it's conceived of in places like in Europe that actually need to exist to achieve those aims. We're also seeing an erosion between public and private sector, particularly because the public sector is procuring services from the private sector. And there are gaps in Canada's privacy laws where privacy law doesn't apply because of those gaps. We also need to, one of the last few things I'll say as well is we need to acknowledge the impossibility of ISET advancing privacy and data protection law in a way that prioritizes human rights, because this ministry exists to prioritize economic innovation. And lastly, I'll return to the question I asked at the beginning, which is, do we want to live in a society where, as Brendan McPhail of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association put it recently at a talk, do we want to live in a society where when we walk on the streets, we're essentially part of a perpetual police lineup? This is said in the context of face recognition technology. And I want to ask, do we want to live in a society where our most sensitive information can be used to analyze and control our behavior? And my answer is no.
Brilliant. Thank you, Yuan. And I think the false sense that you can do it all and that trade-offs aren't real. I mean, the trade-offs are real. And I think you put a real point on one of the ones that we should also return to with privacy and the way it's managed in jurisdiction and economic development. So fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so last panelist, Jess, over to you. And then we're going to spend the remainder of our time in our conversation. So take it away, Jess.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I'd like to thank you, Anna, for this really important work. I think it's a valuable resource to understand tech policy and funding beyond Canada and also in relation to other tech ecosystem. I'm a researcher. I study mostly power relations between spaces, technologies, and people. And here I brought like a few points drawing from my experience mostly in Latin America and here in Canada too. So I'll be admiring the problem a little bit too, Bianca, I'm sorry, but also trying to come up with a few lessons that can be shared and some directions to follow, hopefully, like trying to finish on a hopeful note. So, and 3 points are worth being highlighted here. Market, and I think Canada does a great job on showing how this market operates. And I think it's very important to follow the money and understand how these markets are emerging and consolidating themselves, and the overlapping that we have between AI and smart cities, for example, that it's something that I'll be talking a little bit here today. And of course, we have these big tech companies, but I recommend looking into like local small companies, shape-shifting and rebranding to offer smart and AI services and products too. We saw this, they're very important stakeholders in Brazil, for example. And these markets have two main goals that's worth noting. One is, of course, to cater to specific needs, but also they create demands. They create, like they offer products, they approach mayors, and we saw this happening in so many spaces. And sometimes they don't have like public interest in mind necessarily. And Anna mentioned like this company, sometimes they stop operating here in the global north. And I think the greatest example is live face recognition. Many cities in the north are banning it, but in Brazil, for example, it's being widely adopted too. So can we share strategies between cities and countries on how to detain and avoid the adoption and implementation deployment of a harmful technology over there too? And of course, technology can improve city life, and it's important and it's necessary, but I think we need to learn to identify these artificially created needs. And otherwise, if we don't have, if we prioritize this industry-led policies without a strong regulatory framework, for example, and civic empowerment, we might end up paying for lots of money for ineffective, obsolete, or even harmful technology. So that's when regulatory framework came to mind, and we've been looking to procurements and public-private partnerships, because we've realize this is kind of the cornerstone, the narrative from the industry and the private sector on how to make things happen and implement technology and offer services and products to cities. And cities, sometimes they rely a lot on this kind of transaction to make services more effective to its citizens as well, well-intentioned sometimes. And I think like one really bad example we have to share from Brazil, and this is, I would say, pay attention to legislation being created, developed by the private sector. Like this consultancy firm created the entire master plan of technology and smart cities for a city in Brazil, Juazeiro do Norte. And it's a law, it's a municipal law created by the private sector. And this was the pilot project. They intend to implement this in other cities. And then you have like AI, integrated Internet of Things. You have like all these buzzwords in there. But for example, privacy, data protection, data governance are not there at all, not mentioned at all. So how can we avoid this? And then I go to the more brightful, let's hope, like the hopeful note over here, in terms of social participation, because we also found many barriers, even as researchers, to talk to companies and enter spaces of decision-making. Sometimes these expos and forums, they bring the mayors to receive prize, they rank cities as smartest to least smart, and nobody wants to be like a not smart city when you have this kind of ranking. So, and the decisions were made behind closed doors in areas literally called VIP areas for mayors and companies. We never had access to those areas and the fees and everything. So, and when we interviewed and talked to civil society, they mentioned like it's really hard to have a seat on the table. So how can we overcome this? How can we create opportunities to engage in policymaking and trying to make a difference in here? And a few points to wrap up here, and lessons that can be shared could be like understand social participation as a process, that it's not passive at all. And even when well-intentioned, just providing a link or an email on an online platform for a few weeks or days, it's not going to do the job. It's not going to reach out to everybody. And whenever you have connectivity issues in a country like Brazil and even Canada, we know the digital divide here is still an issue, and the service is expensive and not super accessible, universalized. So we need to find ways and alternatives to listen to people. Online is great, but also like we learned it from stakeholders and civil society organizations that sometimes the good old phone call and in person, I know now it's not a possibility, but in Quito and in São Paulo and in many other cities, people have like to go where people are in different communities so that those voices could be heard as well. So creating collaborative platforms, town halls, all sorts of partnerships between universities and governments and the industry to try to come up with a real collaborative social participation platforms. And we can talk about this in the questions if we have time, about like models used in Brazil that could be useful here in Canada as well to build laws, as the general data protection law we had there and the civil rights framework for the internet were very collaborative and had the involvement of many, many stakeholders in the country. I will stop. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. There is a lot here, and the questions are coming in very quickly and have been. So we're going to spend the remainder of our time on those questions and just really open this up. And I'm going to ask all of the panelists to please try to do as focused a response as possible, because I'm here to embody the people asking the questions and that you're in conversation with. Okay, so that's how I think we should spend the remainder of our time, is trying to be in dialogue with everyone here. And so to that end, I'm going to open up these questions, and I've got one to start while I prepare and read some more of these, which is, there's a significant trend and theme in all of this, which it really points toward private influence. Regulatory capture is one way to think about this problem. There's some very structural pieces, and I think admiring the problem is critical. If you can't name it, you can't move from it, right? So I think Yuan, the structural one that you identified with privacy, is fascinating, because yeah, like there's things to do there. But having said all of that, my question I'd like to open with, and then I'm going to bring more, is for me, one of the issues with regulatory capture, or the idea that you've got private influence really defining, some of how technologies work in the public realm, is that governments and public actors are on the defensive. Really, they're trying to mitigate what is happening through a technology to say, okay, how do we reduce? How do we mitigate? How do we mitigate? And what I think about is the lack of public capacity to actually direct and build and invest in the kinds of technologies that may serve different ends. And I think Nabeel and Valentine, this is also very much down that road of, how do you make sure you've got public purpose served? So that's my one sort of open it up, and I'm going to go rapid fire. Does anyone, want to respond to that quickly in terms of what do we do about the public power, public capacity side of the equation? Does anyone have any thoughts on that immediately? And then I'm going to come at you really quickly with all these wonderful questions that are coming in. So if let's just all unmute ourselves, and just that way we'll be in a quicker conversation together. So please start on that one in terms of where you see some public power, public direction. This is the AI that serves public interest, and how is that being created, generated, thought about? Valentine, I kind of look into you, because I think in the arts community, that's one place I see hope. But thoughts there, and then I'll come back with more questions.
Okay, thank you for pointing to the to the role of the arts. As I was defining civil society organization, I think the arts and cultural sector are not only part of creative industry, which is part of the private sector, and generating huge income for Canada and creating jobs across the country. I think there is an important role for the arts and cultural sector to be more involved in the development and the governance of AI moving forward. 2 years ago, we went across the country and asked artists and cultural workers what their stand was on AI, what they felt they wanted to access about AI, how they wanted to impact AI. We went from north, east, west, across the country, delivered a report called Art Impact AI Report Observation Recommendations. That resulted in policy work with UNDESA at the United Nations, underscoring the role of the arts in digital governance. So again, that should be somewhere in my publications. Happy to share that with everyone afterwards. But to try and sum it up very quickly, we need an independent narrative on AI. We don't want fear about AI. We don't want blind trust in AI either. If by generating fear, we exclude people who might, by definition, be those who don't trust technology, don't engage in policy around AI in the first place. So by causing fear about robot killers, we're not doing societies any favors. As we saw in the numbers that were generated, the narrative right now around AI, I feel a huge push or trust. And let's talk about trust in AI, because right now, if we want to generate policies and governance around AI and funding policies that are beneficial to Canadians and to global citizens, we need more engagement. But I kind of was skimming through the questions myself before you asked, Bianca, and I see, and this is like an age-old opposition between innovation is going to create wealth and going to create jobs. But right now we have to be honest with each other. Even if I put both my shoes into a startup position, a for-profit startup position, there is a lack of adoption of AI. There is a lack of trust in AI. And why is that? So I call to the private sector and to ISED to also ask yourselves that question. There's no opposition between the discussion that we're having today and generating wealth and inclusive innovation across Canada.
I'm really glad you brought that tension up. And so I'm going to move this back, Nabeel, to you directly on one of your topics, because to my mind right now, every day I'm saying, if we're not working on the climate crisis, what are we doing? And I think there's a very real brewing awareness of the computational climate impact. Like this, you don't just use AI and technology and there's no issue there, but redirecting the use of technologies toward things and gender policy, other things that are being brought up in the Q&A. Do you have thoughts on that? Because, and I'm going to come to you, Yuan, next on this, because I think there's been so much granular focus on surveillance personal data, and particularly with health, for example, that other types of administrative data that could help us with like supply chains or pandemic or understanding predictive elements of policy that I think we all want to know more about. So there's opportunity there. What are some of your thoughts on directing it more to public interest, pre-existing? We don't have to wonder if we're interested in the climate crisis as people. I really hope that's one of those, when I say we have some shared values, I mean, there's a point where we got to say, yes, let's go that way. And then Yuan, I'm going to come to you next on a bit of the personal information piece of this. Nabeel?
Yeah, very quickly, I'll just say that I think that actually there is tremendous interest in the public service and in amongst Canadians to see how data and technology can be used to address these things. I'll name an example. The use of sensors to track wildlife and track the evolution of natural assets in urban spaces. I think this is something that we're already using, technology to track, how are the rivers growing or not, right? What is the sea level looking like, right? We're already using this. And I think we can actually show that, work. And that is what's going to build trust and encourage more engagement. To what Valentine said, how can the arts and I think there's no shortage of, techno-optimism. I think we know this, right? In the media as well. But I think we also need to understand, so we can show how it's being used. And I think we can also build more public digital literacy. People have the right to understand how decisions are being made about them. And I think this is, if you think about the bureaucracy and, people's kind of complaints about government, their complaint is typically that it's a black box, that they don't know why a certain decision was made, right? That it's impersonal. We can actually personalize by providing more explanation. And I think that's the opportunity that is staring us in the face right now.
Right. And then I think another one in a pandemic, and I'm seeing some of this with health in particular, and I'm going to come to you on that one. That's an area where there has been just suction, so much ingestion of saying we need all this information because it will be better for health. And that's one of those arguments where people have a real hesitance, to to challenge. It's like, well, if this is going to help us with, spot cancer or understand predictive, X, Y, Z, it would be wrong, to not share that kind of information. However, I also think about the pandemic and the kind of labor related to care. And when I think about policy choices that are about healthy neighborhoods and addressing a lack of loneliness and making sure people, have good health, have a lifestyle that supports health, it's a very different, so many people in public health have worked on that for so long, and that is a non-technical solution. And so, Yuan, I was wondering, like, when you were talking about this structure, there's so much health tech pressure, and there's so much there, but it's always around the corner. It's always around the corner that this big breakthrough is happening. So maybe in the particular context of health, do you have any thoughts on these pieces and maybe how to yes, we want to help with health and tech, but there's something there that also feels uncomfortable about what it starts to get us away from.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the funny thing is, health has its own sort of set of pieces of legislation. So I actually don't know as much about privacy law as it relates to the health sector because it's pretty narrow and specific. I will speak to the potential for gaps in the law, which I'm great at seeing. The question is, would a tech company collecting the data of people, at what point would that constitute falling under, an organization or an activity that falls under the health privacy law in Canada, which exists at both the federal and private and provincial levels? That's a fear. I haven't done much research on that, so I actually don't know. I'm raising a potential issue, and so it's something that's worth researching. I think that's my short answer.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And if anyone else wants to chime in on that one, because there's a lot there, and I think it's one of those, it's one of those spaces where with ICID in particular, I'm just naming, there's just so many, it's if you're listening to someone coming to you and saying, but of course we should invest in this because it will be good for people's health, that conflict there with trying to look after the, the individual protections and then all the potential harms that can come from, that data being used differently. I guess as a quick follow-up, there's sort of advancements now in data where people are going to start to say, we don't need anyone's personal data. We've got synthetic data, or we've got modeled data, or we've got, we don't need yours because we've got someone like you, that's kind of, and I don't know, and, we haven't talked about collective or, other issues related to privacy. I just want to know any follow-up sort of thoughts on that, because I think sometimes people don't know how much privacy doesn't hold harm, like the kinds of harms that we're really staring in the face aren't all held by privacy in any way. And any other gaps or any other thoughts there?
I have two thoughts. The first is that someone raised in the Q&A, I think they were saying this in response to me, and I'm not sure that is a massive assumption. I don't know exactly what they're referring to. However, I was indeed assuming that when companies collect our data, that what, the end result of that is analysis and control of our behavior. That is an assumption that I want to say out loud. Another potentially contentious topic is the use of things like data trusts to share our data. And I think that more research needs to be done on that, particularly from a legal standpoint. And I say that because I took, I've learned about trusts. This is a notion that, just for those who aren't familiar with this topic, and Bianca, please fill in my gaps. My understanding of this notion of data trust is that it's emerged as a solution proposed by some tech companies, potentially other folks, as a way to collect it. The sound you hear is my cat's food. They are being fed right now. I was afraid this was going to happen. There's a second one. I have two cats. Apologies. So what I was going to say is that I don't want to open up a whole can of worms. Please rein me in if this isn't on topic. But my understanding of data trust is that they're a method to have data in a single place, or maybe multiple places, and potentially you could control your data, but data could be shared amongst institutions. One of the problems with the term data trust for me in particular as a legal scholar is that the notion of trusts in its origin was created for people with significant economic wealth to pass that on to future generations. So built into this legal structure of sharing something is the value, I think, are the values of people who hold significant monetary capital who wish to distribute that. My question and my fear is, if we take something that has in its origins and its history certain logics built into that, to what extent are those logics further perpetuated in ways that we didn't intend when we take up a certain legal solution for something? And the same could be set of tech solutions as well.
Totally. I just want to stop and say how much I appreciate the cat feeding sound, just as a human moment and an animal moment all together, because we are animals. So thank you for, no, seriously, that's good. And I really appreciate this question around trust. So I'm just going to say something super quick. So I want to go to Jess. Basically, shared, Eleanor Ostrom's work comments, shared moving from ownership to stewardship models. I think the reason that thinking about trust is interesting is the same reason that land trusts are popping up in response to really problematic urban planning practice, which is, and you can see them as a step to land back in terms of moving from private property to stewardship to, you know, what's next, right? And I think, so I just think that there's, I think maybe looking at the land trust and how that's played out in cities and why it's being, you know, invoked is because it actually creates more sharing power. Can it be completely gamed and lopsided? 100%. So a land trust is inherently, and a data trust inherently not good necessarily. There's nothing good or bad about them. It's the structure. So I think it's creating that opportunity for stewardship, but completely take the point. And there's lots of ways you could have problematic data trust, problematic land trust, like all of history shows those too. So I appreciate that point, and hopefully that's like the like where to go with it. One way to think about it. So Jess, having talked about cities for a second there for a beat, I think the question you raise here around, you know, private actors sort of putting out policy direction, looking at some of the questions here around, like, can you bring in like a gender and intersectional lens to the policy? I mean, are you seeing the private actors take some of these things that we're thinking the public should do and move them into the private, sort of the language capture, or the like, this will be an environmentally sound smart city, or this will be you know, a social justice type smart city? Like, are you seeing this language capture and rhetoric move into the private actor space as they shape this stuff? Bit of a leading question, but.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. Let me see how I can systematize this. First, let's say the mainstream smart cities agenda, and there's lots of AI in there overlapping. I remember when I went to my first expo to do field work, the slogan was connecting everything. And I love it for the wrong reasons, as I always tell Anna, because it's so wrong. And like I see some appropriation of social justice terminology sometimes, like the right to the smart city is one that really bothers me, because it appropriates like a more than 60-year-old movement for justice and fundamental rights in urban spaces and put some technology in there, like as if we had a right to the smart city that is inherent to all of us. In terms of gender, for example, it was appalling and like really problematic to see. We tried to map, and of course, gender identity and expression, it's so difficult to measure, but the number of all male panels, and sometimes like from 4 simultaneous panels, we have like 1 no-male person in there. So it's not even addressed in many of these like mainstream spaces. And that's like a problem, and civil society doesn't have like much access to these discussions anyways, in this like main places where the mayors are and the industries as well. Same for race and ethnicity and other questions. But I do see other movements and stakeholders and researchers, and we have like some amazing organizations in Latin America working for digital rights, and they try to bring up all the time like all these issues and like how can we put it all together, how we can, like, smart cities are there, AI is there, as Valentine said, like we cannot fear it, it's already a reality, it's like not this distant dystopia. So we need to work with what we have like here for us right now. And I've seen some changes for good and bad, like this appropriation on one side and other people trying to shape this agenda as much as they can with the scarce resources they have. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. Because I think some of the comments and questions in here, like, you know, I see people in industry saying, I'm going to consult with community because there's not regulation. I want to try to do the right thing and I don't even have the rules. And I think this is one of these things where Yuan, to your point with ICID too, like not laying down good guardrails doesn't even help industry. And I think this is where we're in a real policy problem, where the government thinks it's helping industry by letting it do whatever, but then they know better, and then they're trying to consult with communities to whom they have no accountability legally. And I think the bar here, and I think Yuan, I'm going to come to you on this question, like we don't need to reinvent human rights. And I think the question with rights is often one of access to those rights. It's not whether or not they are known as to what they should be. It's the access to, and I think from an accountability perspective, this is maybe why intellectual property is such an issue and the black box is such an issue, is because if you can't get to how a decision was made, you have a legal problem. Yuan, could you maybe expand a bit on that? Because so much of this commercial pressure is that stuff gets landed in trade secret and intellectual property, and we have global rules protecting those things from being open. So can you speak a bit to the tension there with that and justice? You know, like how are you supposed to access justice if you can't access the thing that made the decision, right? Like any thoughts there?
Yeah, and I was actually just typing out an answer to the person, Kimberly Smith, who asked, you know, the flip side to privacy is how secrecy can enable abuse and neglect. And to answer that question verbally versus in writing, and to answer yours, Bianca, you're raising a big sort of topic and set of questions. I think that in some, you know, the law will always balance various rights and interests. So you have the right to secrecy for a corporation and their trade secrets, that should be limited. And you have the right to privacy and consent over how your data is collected and when and why and for what purpose and how it's used, which of course has to be limited for things like, in some contexts, national security, et cetera, public safety. I understand that. The problem, of course, is that in Canada, currently, we don't even know when the government, for example, is collecting our data. So when we cross the border, there has been a privacy impact assessment, which I don't understand that was necessary. We cross the border and our biometric information is collected. Right now, as it stands, I have read case law where police at municipal levels and provincial levels have been able to access our face data that has been collected by the government for other purposes. And we don't know when that happens. So I think that part of the reason why I focus a lot in my work on privacy law, which I think should be considered as data protection law, is because there needs to be an explicit balancing act of individuals and the collective right to privacy and the right to control how our data is used, which is really like a lever for the protection of our fundamental freedoms and the freedom to be free from surveillance and to be free to express ourselves as we are. And of course, that will be balanced with other interests. But right now, when there isn't legislation, regulation that is clear, the impact of that it's shrouded in mystery. That's why, along with Anna and her work on open data, I think it's incredibly important for there to be transparent processes so that people in Canada and beyond can know how our data is being collected and used.
Yeah. And I think like there's a comment here around, can't you always seek legal accountability? And I think this gets us back to some of these baselines around, yes, but who has the capacity? Who has the pro bono support? Who has the money to go and chase this stuff down, right? And I think that the way some of these issues are moving into such an elite access to justice realm is troubling, and the way it intersects with trade law, like it's just not a way that it's not go out and let's talk about that, right? Like I find it's just highly inaccessible. I have done my best with some of the ways I framed the questions to like bring some of the themes out from the questions. So I was not reading them verbatim because they were very, I think in some ways pointed. So thanks everyone for the openness of, to move around with this stuff. There's just so many topics, right? And I think if anyone has a, burning last thought, maybe I will go around for a quick one of those. If you don't have one, you don't have to have one. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I wanted to make sure that everyone here, Anna, starting with you, if there was anything that listening to this, you really wanted to make sure you said a thing, and then I'm just going to go across and call everyone in the order of the panel, and then I'll just wrap us up with 1 minute at the end. Anna, maybe to you first.
Yeah, just on your first question around public power, I think for us to have public power, we have to be able to question private power. And it goes back to having independent oversight bodies that are useful and effective for the public, and really push that around accountability that goes beyond legal accountability, and to even understand how we better interact and engage with our government to get to that. I think there's more needed. So just again, having an open space to talk about public money and how it's spent, and also question private power and how it relates to government power.
Fantastic, thank you. Valentine?
Hi, I saw Margie Mendel's question. Hi, Margie, I just wanted to make sure I answered your question. I think it was relative to OBVIA, which is the International Observatory on AI Ethics and Social Impact. Well, I think the silence around it, it's interesting that it wasn't mentioned in this discussion around the role of civil society organizations in the future. I have to say something, given that we're talking about money and OBVIA. My organization is one of the founding members, wrote a letter of support to when the FRQ made a call to various universities to participate and propose a federating model of an international observatory. So I really put a lot of my time into making sure that this became a reality. And the condition I put forward was that the role of civil society organizations, their capacity to engage in these research projects would be supported. It's been 2 years now, and I do collaborate with OBVIA. I do get called upon once in a while to participate in a publication, but it's still sadly impossible for example, AI Impact Alliance or other organizations who were there since the beginning to lead and propose a civil society-led research project cannot be presented. It must be presented from within academia. So I can be invited as civil society's voice to participate and contribute some of my expertise in these projects. But if I want to propose a project, if my organization wants to, it's not possible at this point. And I know there's a lot of work. I've participated in some meetings to make sure that that changes, but that goes back to funding policies within, for example, FRQ or NSERC, or it's across the board. If we want to support art-based research, action-based research, which basically is the type of research that will not just involve as in consult civil society, but also allow the question to emerge from bottom up and be presented and collaborate with researchers in the way that it was done today in a certain way. Because I met Anna a year ago and we started this discussion, and then this research went forward, which is fantastic. It's just a true collaboration. So I think if I want to finish on that note, because we were talking about funding policies today, OBVIA is an amazing organization. I think there's still a little bit of nudging and adjustments to be done to the actual way it works in allocating funds and supporting projects.
Thanks. Over to you, Nabeel.
Just that it's really important to have this conversation continue and not have it end here. I think that would be in the interest of citizens and industry and government to like have a public conversation about this. So
good one. Yeah. Yuan?
Are we saying parting words?
Yes.
I will end with the question I asked twice during my little spiel, which is, do we want to live in a society where right now corporations, by and large, can collect, use and analyze our data in ways that can control and surveil us, that we actually don't want to be the case? And this is particularly an issue, I'll end with a statement as well, for the most vulnerable people in society, such as queer people, people of color, people who have various migrant backgrounds. We need to make sure that we're not just thinking of ourselves when we think of the development of law and how technology should be limited in its use.
Thank you. And Jess?
I think, yes, I agree that this conversation should continue. I value, and I think it's necessary to have more interdisciplinary approaches and studies about data science, about AI, about smartness, and all these markets and industries. And that's great that we start to seeing this more and more, this diverse approach. And even if it's gloomy and we keep like admiring the problem, and sometimes it's really stressful and it has like a terrible impact on our mental health to work with tech and tech policy in many places, I do believe there is room for change and collaborative work and lessons to be learned and shared throughout like cities and countries between ourselves. So yeah, I really appreciate this effort and that this conversation is happening right now. Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Anna, I don't know if you want to have a last word, but anything, you good? Okay, well, at that point, I just want to thank everyone here for so much of this conversation. And I think all of your last points are the good last points, and let's keep the conversation going. And I think we're all game to do that. So thank you for the opportunity to have the conversation today. And until next time.
Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you so much.
everyone.
And thank you, Bianca. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's keep talking.
Thank you.
Thanks.